I begin my sermon today in Centerville, Nebraska. The Wikipedia entry for Centerville states that it is an unincorporated community in Dodge County. It was once nominated to become the county seat, but voters turned the proposal down in an election in 1884. That's it for the Wikipedia entry for Centerville, Nebraska. Why did I look that up? Well, I was perusing my favorite entomology journal the other day, American Entomologist. Isn't that everyone's favorite entomology journal? And I read this story set in Centerville, Nebraska from 1875. It could have been a dust storm rolling in from the west, except that the July breeze wasn't enough to rustle the corn, let alone lift a yellow-brown cloud of soil. In all likelihood, Abram McNeil, like the other settlers in eastern Nebraska, could not fathom what he was seeing on that day. He pulled on the reins of the plow horse, bringing the rig to a stop. The smell of fresh-cut grass perfumed the summer air. Setting the reins over his thigh, he pushed back the brim of his hat and wiped the sweat from his eyes. He could just make out the tops of the cottonwoods along Maple Creek, where John and Arthur Bloomer had staked the first claims in the county 18 years before. Not far beyond that, the eerie cloud drew closer, glints of sunlight flickering along its edges. The horse nickered and shook her mane. Abram might not have understood what was coming, but he knew he had to get back to the homestead. By the time he could see his wife in the garden, she had stopped weeding and was standing stock still. Dropping the hand that had been shading her eyes, she gripped the handle of the hoe and her knuckles whitened. She tried to conceal her growing fear from their daughters who were hidden between the rows, filling a basket with green beans and humming a song from Sunday school. The county's first fair was in another week, and it seemed everyone in the county, 4,200 men, women, and children, would be in Centerville. As the shimmering wave seemed to wash over the hills on the other side of the river, she scooped up the child and headed back to the house. As Abram unhitched the horse, the first one hit him in the cheek and clung to his beard. He swiped at the insect, and it leapt to the ground. As it fluttered back into the air, he knew, although he'd never before seen, what formed the cloud that was now filling the horizon. I was reading this and thought, what on earth is this? This is like the beginning of any and every horror movie ever made, right? The story continues in vivid detail as the swarm arrives at Abram's homestead, every crop consumed, the willow tree bending over under the weight of the insects, the house coated in them. The journal continues, for the first time in his life, Abram might have despaired. Every Sunday, the scattered families in the valley made the trek over dirt roads to the Congregational Church to listen to the Reverend Isaac Heaton explain the blessings that came to the faithful. Like so many of his fellow homesteaders, Abram was likely a devout man condemned to watching his farm be consumed by the locust plague, the same terror that God used to punish the Pharaoh of Egypt. Like so many of his neighbors in Dodge County that blistering July, Abram McNeil had to wonder what had made the Creator so unfairly curse God's children. Pioneers and government agencies tried every imaginable method of controlling these locusts. They prayed for deliverance, organized bounty systems, conscripted able-bodied men, and provided food aid for starving communities. Farmers tried to burn and beat the invaders. They turned to drowning and plowing the eggs or crushing and poisoning the locusts. Elaborate horse-drawn devices were invented, and the most desperate farmers resorted to using dynamite to blast the egg beds of the insects. As courageous and creative as these methods were, the locusts kept coming. In 1895, the largest swarm spread across an area larger than the size of California. Estimates range that the swarm contained 5 to 12 trillion locusts. And then by the early 1900s, they were gone. Perhaps it was changing agricultural practices, climate changes. Theories abound, but they stopped a little over 100 years ago. The locust that ate and destroyed and plagued its way through western North America, they're now extinct. And the story of Abram McNeil feels like it can be put to the side, an almost tragicomic relic of a bygone era. The book of Joel is easy to overlook. It takes about 5 minutes to read, and its historical background is uncertain. We don't know exactly when it was written. We don't know much about Joel at all. The text says he was the son of Petuel, and that would be helpful if we knew anything about Petuel. We have no idea if any of his words came true at any one particular time. We don't know if anybody listened to him. The first chapter describes a locust swarm in vivid detail, but in true prophetic style, he encourages the people to wake up to what's around them. He uses the expression that this is the day of the Lord repeatedly. He says, now is the time with this swarm of locusts. Now is the time to refocus on people's spiritual lives. Now is the time for prayer and meditation. Now is the time for repentance and thanksgiving. But it's not all doom and gloom. Even with the crops gone, it's not all doom and gloom. Even with the cattle moaning, it's not doom and gloom. There's going to be a feast, he says. Do not fear, O soil, which is where our reading for today begins. Imagine this word for Abram McNeil in 1875, do not fear, O soil. The pastures of the wilderness will be green, Abram McNeil. The tree will bear its fruit. The fig tree and the vine will give their full yield. The rains will come. The early rain will come, and the early and the later rain as before. And the threshing floor will be full of grain, and the vats shall overflow. And you shall eat in plenty and be satisfied and praise the name of the Lord your God. And there were so many, of course, plenty of chances this week to eat and be satisfied and to notice how full the floor of the threshing floor was. Yesterday, I was in Connecticut with my best friend for, more than 2/3 of my life now. He lives in Connecticut, and we were hiking in the woods outside Guilford. Leaves underfoot, the last few falling from the branches in a light breeze. Children made walking sticks, accidentally, maybe not accidentally, putting a foot into the cold stream, stopping for a snack of corn muffins and flavored tea. You can imagine the scene. Busy chit-chatting, so busy, in fact, that we missed the trail marker that we were supposed to follow. You can imagine the scene, getting way off course and realizing that it was getting dark soon. You can imagine the scene. We bushwhacked through the woods about half a mile, seeing on our phones a road that we could get to, and then we could follow it to another road, which would get us to the car. Not to worry, we bushwhacked through to discover that the road was actually part of the town dump where all the leaves are deposited in Guilford, Connecticut. If you've ever been to Guilford, Connecticut, I just want to remind you of how many trees are in Guilford, Connecticut. Millions upon millions of leaves from hundreds and hundreds of those brown bags that we all have, which we had to then traipse through and on in order to get out of our predicament. And the smell, we know the smell of decaying vegetation, right? But the smell of millions upon millions of leaves decaying all at once, the smell was so dense, and I wouldn't personally call it nice. It is very unique. And as we were navigating our way through these huge mounds of slowly decaying leaves, Lita, my friend's 7-year-old daughter, said, "It smells like peppermint ice cream here," which is not how I would describe it, but I love that that's how Lita would describe it. This pile of leaves, this beautiful, lush pile of leaves fills my mind on the back of Thanksgiving on Thursday and all of its blessings. We were here at church, 21 of us gathered. We saw the results of the threshing floor being full of grain and the vats overflowing, eating in plenty. Of course, we worried about there would be too little, and of course, we came home with like 4 pies still fully intact. Too much. There was too much at my table. There was probably too much at yours as well. This week was so incredibly rich. On Monday, a number of us from Union Kong gathered on Bloomfield Avenue to celebrate the life of Judy Schoenberg. What a beautiful service, a memorial service that was cast as a life play. Instead of a program, there was a playbill. Some of the various characters in her life's play appeared in that playbill as the performers. The man next door was her longtime neighbor, childhood friend was there. In my case, the pastor was listed in the playbill, and so forth. Eric and Emily wanted an expression of Judy's character in a particular location, in a particular style that was just right for her. At the end of a slideshow with accompanying music playing, the audience, all of us, were invited to stand and sing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" in the nearly dark room, and then offer Judy a round of applause for her performance, her life's work, for she had indeed put on a great show for all who were gathered. It was such a profoundly rich moment, beautiful and painful all at the same time, as life was celebrated in a way that was so deeply authentic for Judy and her family. It is, and I feel like we don't make enough of this sometimes, such an immensely rich time to be alive, to be afforded the luxuries of walking leisurely through the decaying leaves piled high, lost amidst the decay, never actually worrying, even with fading light, convinced of either our own abilities or the abilities of our iPhones to get us home. Dishes piled high with food, we laugh and we sing and we count our blessings, the threshing floor full of grain. The stunningly beautiful ways in which we might remember one another in community, softly, tenderly, not knowing what to say, but being together and paying tribute. It is an astonishing time to realize the multitude of blessings about which Joel could only paint a picture of, about which Joel's contemporaries couldn't possibly imagine. And so it occurs to me that the prophecy has in fact come full circle. The threshing floors are full of grain. For many of us, at least in this room, there is plenty of plenty for the people. If you are sat at a table full of sides and pies, then you are beyond any measure that the prophet could have envisioned. And instead of the locust being here and the overflowing vats being on the horizon, the vats are here. Thanksgiving and legacy, there is so much to be thankful for and so much for us left to do. The headlines in our local papers are now not what will happen when the climate changes, but they are instead, here was round one. Here are the early salvos. Here, people, you see the streets of Miami Beach and Venice flooding regularly. Here are the jeeps floating down Route 46 or near Route 46, if you remember that from August. Here are the fires. Here's Paradise, California. It is the most astonishing locust swarm because, unlike Abram McNeil and his contemporaries, we have a say, perhaps even a significant one, in how many locusts arrive at the homestead. Life is so abundantly rich, so heaving with possibilities, so astonishing in its gifts. From nature to technology, from our food and tables to the ways in which we gather as communities to support one another, it is so extraordinarily fantastic to be alive to that, to be alive to possibilities, to breathe the air and to be grateful, to break bread and be thankful, to exchange a sign of peace and be present for it. And so, people of God, I invite you to return to your bulletins and let us pray together. Living God, we give you thanks on this day for all your works in creation. We thank you for the bounty of harvest and the beauty of the earth. Forgive us, O God, when we have been short-sighted and have used the earth for our own gain, rather than caring for the earth as your creation. Forgive us, O God, when we have made our own worries and frets greater problems for others, rather than lifting up our concerns to you. Guide us in ways we may live our lives that help to sustain the earth. Help us to seek your vision for our lives. Remind us that there is a difference between our wants and needs, and help us to discern the difference so that we might help our neighbors in need.